At 11:42 p.m., Ethan Brooks received a phone call that would change his life forever. At the time, he didn't know it. In fact, when the phone started vibrating on the nightstand beside his bed, Ethan almost ignored it completely. It had been a long day. The kind of day that ends with exhaustion, routine, and the comforting belief that tomorrow will look exactly like today. But some phone calls divide a life into two parts: the life before and the life after. Ethan Brooks would spend the next several weeks wishing he had understood that sooner. For months, he believed he knew exactly who he could trust. He believed loyalty was earned through years of shared experiences. He believed the people closest to him were exactly who they claimed to be. He believed the future was secure. He was wrong. 3 weeks later, police officers would be standing outside his home before sunrise. Neighbors would gather at the ends of their driveways. Detectives would begin asking questions. Reporters would eventually tell a story that sounded impossible to anyone who knew him. And at the center of that story was a truth Ethan Brooks never saw coming. The warning signs had been there all along. The lies, the missing money, the conversations that suddenly stopped when he entered a room, the strange explanations that somehow always sounded reasonable, the details that felt insignificant until they were placed beside one another. Looking back, the clues seem obvious. They always do. But when you're living inside the story, the truth often hides behind familiarity. That's what makes stories like this so unsettling. The danger rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly. One conversation, one decision, one overlooked detail at a time. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened to Ethan Brooks wasn't the result of a single mistake. It was the result of something much harder to recognize: trust. The kind of trust that builds over years. The kind of trust that convinces you certain questions never need to be asked. The kind of trust that can blind you to things happening right in front of you. And by the time Ethan Brooks finally realized the truth, everything he thought he knew about his life had already begun falling apart. The most disturbing part wasn't what he discovered. It was how long the truth had been sitting there unnoticed, waiting. So what exactly did Ethan Brooks miss? And why did he only realize the truth when it was already too late? At first glance, this looked like a normal family story. If you had met Ethan Brooks a year before everything changed, you probably would have described him as successful, hardworking, and fortunate. At 52 years old, Ethan had spent most of his adult life building something he could be proud of. He owned a small construction company that had grown steadily over the years, earning him a reputation as someone who kept his word and delivered quality work. In his community, people respected him. Local business owners knew him by name. Clients trusted him. Friends admired the life he had built through years of persistence and long hours. To most people, Ethan Brooks represented a version of the American dream that still felt attainable. A stable business, a comfortable home, a marriage that had survived the challenges of time. Standing beside him through all of it was his wife, Sarah Brooks. For 24 years, Sarah had been part of nearly every chapter of Ethan's life. Friends often described her as warm, intelligent, and easy to talk to. She remembered birthdays, organized family gatherings, and seemed capable of making people feel comfortable within minutes of meeting them. Neighbors trusted her. Friends confided in her. Even those who barely knew the couple often assumed Sarah and Ethan had one of those rare marriages built on complete honesty and mutual respect. From the outside, they appeared inseparable. But appearances can be remarkably convincing. And sometimes the stories people show the world are very different from the stories unfolding behind closed doors. Then there was Detective Brian Cole. At the time, Brian had no reason to believe his name would eventually become connected to Ethan and Sarah Brooks. He had spent years investigating financial crimes, fraud cases, and complex disputes that often started with something small before revealing something much larger underneath. Experience had taught him that the most important details were rarely the dramatic ones. More often, they were buried inside ordinary moments people overlooked. A phone call, a transaction, a conversation that seemed harmless, a decision that felt insignificant. Months later, Detective Brian Cole would find himself examining exactly those kinds of details as he attempted to answer questions that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Because the deeper investigators looked into the lives of Ethan and Sarah Brooks, the more confusing the picture became. What was Sarah hiding? Why didn't Ethan see it sooner? And what discovery was powerful enough to destroy a life that had taken decades to build? At first, nobody believed there was a mystery at all. Friends saw a successful couple. Neighbors saw stability. Business associates saw reliability. Everything looked normal. Everything looked secure. Everything looked exactly the way Ethan Brooks believed it was. But investigators would eventually uncover a truth nobody expected. A truth that would force everyone involved to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the people at the center of this story. And perhaps the most surprising part is that none of it began with a dramatic confrontation. There was no shouting, no obvious warning, no moment that immediately signaled disaster. Instead, it started with something so ordinary that Ethan barely gave it a second thought. A decision that seemed completely harmless. A decision that would quietly set everything else in motion. And once that decision was made, there would be no turning back. To understand why Ethan Brooks failed to recognize the warning signs sooner, you first have to understand the life he believed he was living. Ethan grew up in a small town in Ohio where hard work was treated almost like a family tradition. His father worked construction, his grandfather worked construction, and from a young age, Ethan learned that success usually came one long day at a time. There were no shortcuts in the Brooks household. If something needed to be built, repaired, or earned, you did it yourself. That mindset stayed with Ethan long after he left home. While many of his friends chased different careers, Ethan remained focused on a simple goal: building a stable future. He started with small jobs, took on projects others didn't want, and gradually turned a modest operation into a respected construction company. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. By the time he reached his early 50s, Ethan employed several workers, maintained steady contracts, and had earned a reputation as someone clients could trust. The people who worked with Ethan often described him using the same words: reliable, honest, loyal. He showed up early, stayed late, and rarely asked others to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. 6 days a week, he poured his energy into growing the business. While some business owners spent weekends networking or attending corporate events, Ethan was often on job sites checking progress or reviewing plans for upcoming projects. His commitment helped create the life he had always wanted: a comfortable home, financial stability, a respected position in the community. Looking back, many people would later say that Ethan spent so much time protecting the future that he never imagined the greatest threat to that future could come from a place he trusted completely. Sarah Brooks appeared to be the perfect partner for that life. Where Ethan was quiet and reserved, Sarah was social and engaging. She volunteered at community events, participated in local charity fundraisers, and somehow seemed to know everyone in town. Friends enjoyed being around her because she made conversations feel effortless. Neighbors often stopped to talk with her while walking their dogs or collecting mail. She remembered details about people's lives, asked thoughtful questions, and had a way of making others feel valued. Over the years, Sarah became one of those familiar faces people naturally trusted. If someone needed help organizing an event, Sarah volunteered. If a neighbor was going through a difficult time, Sarah was usually among the first to offer support. Her reputation was built on kindness, and few people ever questioned it. Together, Ethan and Sarah Brooks looked like the definition of the American dream. They had been married for more than 24 years. They owned a beautiful home. Their finances appeared stable. They vacationed occasionally, attended community gatherings, and celebrated milestones surrounded by friends and family. To the outside world, their relationship represented the kind of long-term success many couples hope to achieve. There was no public drama, no obvious conflict, no visible signs that anything was wrong. If someone had predicted that their story would eventually become the center of an investigation, most people would have dismissed the idea immediately. Yet while the image of their life remained intact on the surface, small details were beginning to emerge beneath it. At first, those details were easy to explain away. Sarah started spending more time on her phone than usual. During dinner conversations, notifications would appear, and she often glanced at the screen before turning the device face down on the table. Ethan noticed the change, but thought little of it. Everyone spends time on their phones. Everyone gets messages. There was nothing alarming about it. At least not yet. Then came the unexplained absences. Sarah occasionally mentioned errands that seemed to take longer than expected. Sometimes she would leave in the afternoon and return hours later with simple explanations about shopping, meeting friends, or helping organize community activities. Ethan accepted those explanations without hesitation. After all, Sarah had spent years earning his trust. Why would he suddenly start questioning her now? Why would he assume ordinary events carried hidden meanings? There were also small financial inconsistencies that appeared from time to time. Minor transactions. Withdrawals that Ethan didn't immediately recognize. Payments connected to accounts he rarely reviewed. None of the amounts were large enough to create immediate concern, and because Ethan spent most of his energy focused on the construction business, he often postponed looking into them. Whenever he noticed something unusual, Sarah usually had an explanation ready. The answers sounded reasonable, and Ethan accepted them because accepting them felt easier than imagining another possibility. The truth is that trust creates blind spots. It allows people to overlook details they would immediately question if those same details came from a stranger. When you've trusted someone for 20 years, questioning them feels almost impossible. You don't look for deception because you don't expect to find it. You interpret unusual behavior through the lens of history, loyalty, and familiarity. Every explanation sounds believable because you already believe in the person giving it. That was exactly what happened to Ethan Brooks. The warning signs appeared one at a time, scattered across weeks and months in ways that never seemed urgent enough to demand immediate attention. But later, when investigators reconstructed the timeline, those same details would look very different. What once appeared harmless would suddenly seem significant. What once looked ordinary would begin connecting into a pattern. And then one bank statement changed everything. The turning point arrived in a way so ordinary that Ethan Brooks almost missed it completely. It wasn't a dramatic phone call. It wasn't a shocking confession. It wasn't even an argument. It was a bank statement. One of dozens he had reviewed over the years without much thought. Like many small business owners, Ethan regularly checked financial records to make sure payroll, vendor payments, and project expenses were being processed correctly. Most of the time, the routine was uneventful. Numbers came in. Numbers went out. Bills were paid. Accounts balanced. But one Monday evening, while sitting at the kitchen table reviewing transactions from the previous month, Ethan noticed something he couldn't immediately explain. There was a withdrawal for $2,000 from an account he and Sarah shared. The amount wasn't large enough to create a financial crisis, but it was large enough to catch his attention. At first, Ethan assumed it was a simple mistake. Banks make errors. Transactions get mislabeled. Automatic payments occasionally appear under unfamiliar descriptions. He highlighted the withdrawal and made a mental note to call the bank later in the week if the issue didn't resolve itself. When Sarah came into the kitchen that evening, he mentioned it casually. Sarah barely looked surprised. She explained that the money had been used to cover an unexpected expense connected to a community project she had been helping organize. Her answer came quickly and confidently, and it sounded reasonable enough. Ethan nodded, accepted the explanation, and moved on. If the story had ended there, he probably would have forgotten about the transaction entirely. But 2 days later, another withdrawal appeared. This one was smaller, but it carried the same unfamiliar pattern. Again, Ethan looked at the transaction history. Again, he struggled to remember authorizing it. And again, Sarah had an explanation ready. She told him the payment was connected to supplies purchased for an event she was helping coordinate. The answers sounded believable, especially coming from someone who had spent years involved in community activities. Ethan wanted to trust her explanation because trusting it required far less effort than questioning it. Yet something about the situation lingered in the back of his mind. By Friday, the concern became harder to ignore. Additional transactions appeared across multiple accounts. Individually, none of them seemed alarming. Together, they painted a picture Ethan couldn't easily explain. The amounts varied. Some were withdrawals. Others were transfers. A few were connected to accounts he rarely checked. The total was beginning to grow, and for the first time, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced earlier in the week: uncertainty. He sat down with several months of financial records spread across his desk and started tracing the transactions one by one. The deeper he looked, the more questions appeared. What initially seemed like a recent issue stretched backward through previous statements. There were withdrawals he hadn't noticed, transfers that no longer made sense, payments connected to descriptions that felt unusually vague. Some transactions were separated by weeks, making them difficult to spot unless someone examined the records carefully. Ethan realized that if he had not caught the first withdrawal, he might never have connected the others at all. That weekend, he confronted Sarah more directly. Unlike their earlier conversations, this discussion carried a different tone. Ethan wanted specifics. He wanted dates, receipts, and explanations that matched the numbers in front of him. Sarah remained calm. She insisted there was nothing unusual happening and repeated many of the explanations she had already given. Some of them sounded convincing. Others felt less certain. Yet after 24 years of marriage, Ethan still found himself wanting to believe her. Every answer was filtered through decades of trust, and that trust made it difficult to determine whether his concerns were justified or simply the result of misunderstanding. For a while, Sarah's explanation seemed enough, but the numbers kept growing. What started as a single unexplained withdrawal evolved into a pattern Ethan could no longer dismiss. He spent evenings reviewing bank records, credit card statements, and account histories stretching back several months. The process revealed inconsistencies that seemed impossible to ignore. Dates didn't align. Some transactions appeared connected to locations Sarah had never mentioned visiting. Others involved accounts Ethan didn't recognize at all. The more information he uncovered, the more he realized he was looking at something far larger than a bookkeeping error. Then he found the detail that changed everything. Buried among transaction records was a payment linked to a name Ethan had never seen before. It wasn't a business contact. It wasn't a family member. It wasn't anyone from their social circle. The name appeared repeatedly across several records, connected to transfers that stretched back further than Ethan expected. Curious and increasingly uneasy, he began searching for additional information. What he found only deepened the mystery. The same name appeared alongside communication records and account activity that Sarah had never mentioned. For several moments, Ethan simply stared at the information in front of him. The financial questions were no longer just about missing money. They were about a person connected to Sarah in ways Ethan did not understand. A person whose existence raised questions he wasn't prepared to answer. And that was the moment Ethan Brooks realized he didn't know his own wife nearly as well as he thought. The days that followed were some of the most confusing Ethan Brooks had ever experienced. For nearly 24 years, whenever something in his life stopped making sense, Sarah had usually been the person he turned to for answers. Now she was the source of the questions. The unfamiliar name connected to the financial records refused to leave his mind. Every time he reviewed the transactions, the same pattern emerged. Payments, transfers, activity that stretched back much further than he originally believed. Ethan wanted a simple explanation, something that would allow him to close the files, apologize for his suspicions, and return to the life he thought he knew. Instead, every new discovery pushed him further in the opposite direction. At first, Ethan continued investigating on his own. He reviewed months of statements, compared dates, and searched for explanations that would make the numbers fit together logically. But the deeper he looked, the more complicated everything became. Eventually, he reached a point where he realized he needed help. Through a business contact, Ethan was introduced to a private investigative firm with experience handling financial disputes and fraud-related cases. Reluctantly, he handed over copies of the records and asked them to answer a question he could no longer answer himself. What exactly was happening behind his back? The investigators started with the financial trail. Within days, they discovered accounts Ethan had never seen before. Some were connected indirectly to Sarah through information hidden behind layers of transactions. Others appeared to operate independently while still receiving money that could ultimately be traced back to funds from Ethan and Sarah's shared finances. The investigators explained that the structure looked deliberate, designed in a way that made it difficult for someone casually reviewing statements to notice unusual activity. What had appeared to Ethan as isolated transactions now looked like part of a much larger system. Then came the communications. The investigative team uncovered evidence suggesting that the financial activity was connected to conversations Sarah had never disclosed. Phone records revealed frequent contact with numbers Ethan didn't recognize. Some communications occurred late at night. Others took place during hours Sarah had claimed to be attending community events or meeting friends. When investigators compared those communications with transaction histories, they noticed a pattern. Certain calls and messages appeared shortly before transfers moved between accounts. The timing was difficult to ignore. When Ethan confronted Sarah again, her explanations began changing. Details that once sounded certain suddenly became vague. Timelines shifted. Stories that had previously seemed straightforward no longer matched the evidence being uncovered. Every answer created two new questions. If the money wasn't being used for the reasons Sarah originally described, where was it going? If she wasn't communicating with the people she claimed to be meeting, who exactly was she talking to? And perhaps most troubling of all, how long had this been happening? As the situation escalated, the effects spread beyond Ethan and Sarah. Friends who had known the couple for years started hearing different versions of the story. Some believed Sarah's explanations. Others sided with Ethan. Conversations that once centered on family gatherings and community events became dominated by speculation and uncertainty. Relationships that had taken years to build suddenly felt strained. Family members found themselves caught between loyalty and uncomfortable questions. Rumors began circulating through social circles and local businesses. People who once viewed Ethan and Sarah as an example of stability now spoke about them in whispers. It was during this period that Detective Brian Cole first became involved. The growing financial irregularities eventually attracted the attention of authorities after reports connected to suspicious transactions were filed through official channels. What had begun as a private effort to understand missing money was slowly evolving into something larger. Detective Cole reviewed preliminary reports, financial summaries, and interview notes gathered from multiple sources. While he had seen many cases involving financial deception, something about this situation stood out. The volume of activity, the hidden accounts, and the layers of explanations suggested a level of planning that deserved closer examination. Meanwhile, Ethan became consumed by a single question: how far back did this go? Every week seemed to reveal another piece of information that pushed the timeline further into the past. Transactions he originally believed were recent turned out to have older connections. Communications that appeared isolated were linked to conversations stretching back months. The life Ethan thought he understood was beginning to look unfamiliar. Then investigators discovered the piece of evidence that changed everything. It wasn't another bank record. It wasn't another account. And it wasn't a transaction. It was something far more significant. Something that connected multiple parts of the investigation in a way nobody had anticipated. What they found completely changed the case. The evidence investigators uncovered did not point to a single hidden transaction or one isolated act of deception. Instead, it revealed something much larger. As Detective Brian Cole and the investigative team continued examining records connected to Sarah Brooks, they discovered that the financial activity Ethan had stumbled upon was only one piece of a far more complicated picture. The accounts, the transfers, and the unexplained withdrawals were not the destination. They were the trail leading toward something else. Something Sarah had spent years carefully keeping separate from the life everyone believed she was living. Investigators found evidence suggesting that Sarah had maintained an entirely different identity alongside the one Ethan knew. Different accounts, different communications, different circles of people who knew her by details that never existed within her marriage. The hidden financial records connected to names, addresses, and activities Ethan had never heard discussed in 24 years together. What shocked investigators most was not simply the existence of these records, but how long they appeared to have existed. The timeline stretched back years. Long before Ethan noticed the missing money. Long before the strange transactions. Long before anyone had reason to suspect anything was wrong. The money was never the real story. It was simply the first clue. As the investigation expanded, the pieces began fitting together in a way that left Ethan struggling to understand how he had missed them. The unexplained absences, the late-night messages, the moments when Sarah seemed distracted during conversations, the transactions that appeared insignificant when viewed individually. Each detail had existed in plain sight, yet none of them seemed alarming enough on their own to challenge 2 decades of trust. Looking back, Ethan could suddenly see connections that had once appeared invisible. Events that felt unrelated now formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. For the first time since the investigation began, Ethan stopped asking whether there had been a misunderstanding. There wasn't. The truth was far more difficult than that. He simply couldn't see it because he trusted the wrong person. The emotional impact spread quickly through everyone connected to the case. Family members who had spent years celebrating holidays together found themselves questioning memories they once considered reliable. Friends who had defended Sarah during the early stages of the investigation struggled to reconcile the evidence with the person they believed they knew. Relationships that had taken decades to build began collapsing under the weight of new information. Some people refused to believe the findings entirely. Others accepted them immediately. But nobody remained untouched by what was being uncovered. As legal proceedings began, the situation moved from private conversations and investigative reports into public view. Court filings brought details of the investigation into the open. Reporters gathered outside hearings. Community members followed updates closely, trying to understand how a couple who appeared so stable could become the center of such a complicated case. Inside the courtroom, attorneys presented records, timelines, communications, and testimony that reconstructed years of hidden activity. Each revelation seemed to answer one question while creating another. For Ethan Brooks, the courtroom was where the final illusion disappeared. Sitting through testimony forced him to hear details of his own life explained by strangers examining records and evidence. Dates that once represented ordinary memories now carried entirely different meanings. Events he believed he understood were reinterpreted through facts he never possessed at the time. Piece by piece, the version of reality he had trusted for years was replaced by one he barely recognized. And that was the real tragedy of the story. The tragedy wasn't that the warning signs didn't exist. They did. The tragedy wasn't that the truth was impossible to discover. It wasn't. The tragedy was that Ethan recognized the warning signs only after everything fell apart. By then, the trust was gone. The relationships were fractured. The future he believed he was building no longer existed. And no amount of hindsight could change what had already happened. Here's the continuation in the same style, using Ethan Brooks, Sarah Brooks, and Detective Brian Cole consistently. Stories like this force us to ask uncomfortable questions. Not because the answers are easy, but because they challenge assumptions most of us carry every day. How much do we really know about the people closest to us? It's a question that feels simple until a story like Ethan Brooks reminds us how complicated the answer can be. For years, Ethan believed he understood the person sitting across from him at the dinner table. He believed he understood the routines, the conversations, the plans for the future, and the life they had built together. Like most people, he trusted the evidence of everyday experience. Shared holidays, family milestones, ordinary mornings, quiet evenings, the thousands of small moments that create the feeling of truly knowing another person. And for a long time, that feeling seemed completely justified. But what makes stories like this so unsettling is the realization that the truth rarely arrives in a dramatic moment. It doesn't usually announce itself. It doesn't appear with flashing lights or obvious warnings. Instead, it reveals itself slowly. One inconsistency, one unexplained decision, one overlooked detail at a time. Looking back, Ethan could trace the path clearly. The unusual withdrawals, the late-night messages, the changing explanations, the names he didn't recognize, the moments that felt slightly out of place but never seemed important enough to challenge. Each clue existed on its own for months, sometimes years. Yet none of them seemed significant enough to overcome 24 years of trust. And that's what makes hindsight so powerful. Once the truth becomes visible, the warning signs appear obvious. But before that moment arrives, they often blend into the background of everyday life. It's easy to judge decisions after the outcome is known. It's much harder to recognize what those decisions looked like in real time. Which brings us back to the beginning. Back to 11:42 p.m. Back to the phone call that Ethan Brooks almost ignored. At the time, it felt like one ordinary moment among thousands of others. A phone vibrating in the middle of the night. Nothing more. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested the life he thought he understood was about to change forever. But that call would eventually lead to questions. Those questions would lead to records. The records would lead to discoveries. And the discoveries would lead to a truth Ethan never imagined he would have to face. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It arrived one clue at a time. One piece of evidence. One unanswered question. One hidden detail after another. And Ethan Brooks realized it too late. Because sometimes the most dangerous lies are not the ones told by strangers. Sometimes they come from familiar voices. Trusted faces. People we believe we know better than anyone else. And sometimes the hardest truth to accept is that the person we trusted most may have been living a story we never truly understood. So here's the question. If you were Ethan Brooks, would you have spotted the warning signs? Would the unexplained withdrawals have caught your attention sooner? Would you have questioned the late-night messages, the changing explanations, and the details that didn't quite seem to fit together? Or would you have done exactly what Ethan did and trusted Sarah Brooks, because 24 years of history felt stronger than a handful of unanswered questions? Stories like this are difficult because there are rarely simple answers. Most people don't expect deception from the people they love. Most people don't wake up one morning believing that the life they've spent years building may not be what it seems. That's why cases like this continue to spark debate long after they're over. So let me know what you think in the comments. If you had been in Ethan Brooks' position, at what point would you have started asking questions? And if you enjoy stories where a single discovery changes everything, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next investigation. Because if you thought this story was shocking, wait until you hear what happened to the man who spent 10 years searching for someone who was hiding in plain sight the entire time. Trust me, that story begins with a mystery even stranger than this one.